This evening we have chosen to discuss a very difficult, very remarkable, and very controversial book. In recent years, of course, the rapid motion of our way of life has very largely obscured the literature of the late 19th century. Yet there are books that have continued to be highly provocative. And among others, we can mention the writings of Jules Verne, whose anticipation of the shape of things to come was uncanny in its prevision. We have in this case a book that is mysterious and remarkable in a number of ways. Perhaps the formula of it is rather close to our modern concept of science fiction. All that I can do in connection with this book is to sketch through and summarize certain aspects of it. And those who are sufficiently interested may, of course, enlarge their researches. The book itself appeared many years ago. This is the first edition. And it carries a very interesting title page. It says here, Etidorhpa, or The End of Earth, the strange history of a mysterious being, and the account of a remarkable journey, as communicated in manuscript to Llewyllyn Drury, who promised to print the same, but finally evaded the responsibility, which was assumed by John Uri Lloyd, with many illustrations by J. Augustus Knapp, copyrighted Cincinnati, 1895. Now this is a rather impressive heading, but of course many fictional books can be made to sound impressive. Curiously, this work deals with a number of subjects that created an almost immediate reaction in the public mind. And for 10 or 15 years, the book was the center of a storm and controversy, such as perhaps is not common with most books. My own contact with it is perhaps a little better than most of those who now might read the work. I had the pleasure of corresponding with John Uri Lloyd before his death concerning the book. And as you probably, many of you remember, Mr. J. Augustus Knapp, the illustrator, was a close friend of mine for many years and was illustrator of our large book on symbolism and several other of my publications. Mr. Knapp was for years an artist working for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios. He was a graduate of the Cincinnati Art Institute, and he was engaged as a comparatively young man by John Uri Lloyd to do the illustrations for this book. Lloyd himself was a man of parts. He was the head of the Lloyd Pharmaceutical Company, at that time one of the most important pioneers in pharmaceutical research in the United States and a leader in his chosen field. He was a chemist, a scholar, a man of very high responsibility and reputation. It would be inevitable that when a man whose business, profession, and life deal largely with scientific matters, whose reputation in his community was above reproach, it was inevitable that when such a book as this should come with his imprint, that it should cause not only a great deal of consternation, but a great deal of embarrassment to Mr. Lloyd. He told me, and Mr. Knapp seconded and supported his general statement, that it has been his policy from 1895, when the book was published, to the time shortly before his death, when I last communicated with him, that he refused to discuss the book Etidorhpa in any way or under any circumstances and conditions. He said what he had placed in the book was the story, and that any more of the story that he knew would die with him. Very largely, this proved to be the truth. Mr. Knapp, on the other hand, was quite an ingenious and thoughtful person, and having been appointed to illustrate the book, he carried on discreetly a number of researches of his own, and in the course of time he became so convinced that he was dealing with a very serious scientific work that he actually attempted to follow the footsteps of the story and to check every part of it so far as was physically possible. This he did, and he even discovered most of the landmarks which are referred to in the book. As a result of his researches, he says that that part of the book which can be checked by the present knowledge that we possess, he has checked, and that the author of it was correct and accurate in his description of persons, places, and circumstances, and that there were many corroborating witnesses who, after the book was published, admitted that they were party to some of the facts which it contained. Thus, we are not dealing with a book of pure fiction. We are dealing with a book which has at least a completely factual springboard. After a certain point in the story, which we will arrive at in due time, it is obvious that the story cannot be checked by ordinary means. This was one of the great tragedies in the life of Mr. Knapp. He hoped throughout his years that someday he could do what the Alcoa program suggests, take that one step beyond, that he would be able to proceed further in the mysterious journey of this remarkable person. But finally, failing health and advancing years, and the physical arduousness of the project, which was an immediate danger to life and health, made it impractical for Mr. Knapp to make that one step beyond. In the description of the book, we will come to the place where Mr. Knapp had to make that final decision. The manuscript, as it is published or presented by John Uri Lloyd, came to him through a misadventure. The original custodian was a man by the name of Llewyllyn Drury. It was Mr. Drury who had the original contact with the mysterious hero of this story. He was instructed to take the manuscript, which was in the autograph of the original author, and to place it in his vault or safe, sealed and held, not to be published or opened for the period of 30 years. At the end of that time, the manuscript was to be unsealed, placed in the hands of an editor, prepared for publication, and illustrated by an appropriate illustrator. It was then to be distributed or circulated or published, at least in a limited edition. As a result of this publication, should certain persons mentioned in the book and selected by the original authors to be his beneficiaries be discovered or be still alive, the proceeds and profits of the book were to pass to them as partial compensation for a great unpaid debt. Mr. Drury, when the time came for the publication of the book, evaded his responsibility. He evidently felt that the work was too controversial and perhaps would endanger his reputation. He therefore finally contacted Mr. Lloyd, who agreed to take on the peculiar responsibility. It is therefore the fact that John Uri Lloyd was a sort of substitute for the original person who was responsible for the publication of the manuscript. This would seem to account for a number of discrepancies in the original plan, because John Uri Lloyd never made any claim to have had personal contact with the original author. However, Mr. Knapp told me that Mr. Lloyd did have contact with the personal author, and that he, Mr. Knapp, when commissioned to prepare the illustrations for the work, actually was able to make the portraiture, which became the frontispiece, because he also met the original author on the street in Cincinnati. Now, what all this adds up to is mystery. How mysterious, you will note a little later. Now we have another peculiarity of our narration, inasmuch as it contains a considerable amount of double talk. This double talk seems to bear upon another incident or another circumstance which much earlier created a very broad stir and a considerable scandal in the United States. About the year 1827, a Captain William Morgan, for reasons perhaps best known to Captain Morgan, unless we wish to believe the explanation given in the book Etidorhpa, attempted to prepare and cause to be published a complete expose of the rites, rituals, and ceremonies of Freemasonry. This Captain William Morgan was himself apparently obligated by Masonic obligations, and he broke these obligations and prepared this expose, which was not only printed later, but passed through many editions, and these later printings apparently did not cause any perpetuation of the original tragedy. In 1827, we have to realize that life in the United States was considerably different from what it is today. It was a time in which feelings on many subjects ran very high, and there was in this country quite a marked division between pro-Masonic and anti-Masonic feeling. This feeling ran deep, largely probably due to propaganda and to a number of very vicious misrepresentations which appeared in the press and took on political coloring at about that time and somewhat earlier. Involvement of certain European secret societies in Bavaria and other regions had caused people to be afraid that secret societies were attempting to undermine the political future of the United States. Even at one time, George Washington suffered from fear in this direction. Actually, also, the situation among the people religiously was a little different from what it is now. Although Freemasonry has never been advanced as a religious organization, there can be no doubt that its principles have exercised a broad religious influence upon a great many people. This influence has been consistently constructive, but in a day when it was very important only to consider the name of the religion or the sect to which you belong, and you are not religious unless you belong to the prevailing faith of your community, and that you would be subject to being bitterly persecuted even if you belong to an unpopular sect. With these considerations, we can see why what was termed the unorthodoxy of Masonic idealistic thinking might have been a rather serious problem in the lives of small merchants and farmers and individuals with comparatively slight contact with the larger problems of comparative religion, most of which they had never heard of. In any event, the work by Captain Morgan brought down upon him some kind of a retaliation which could well have been rather dramatic in the day in which he lived. He was warned, he was pled with, he was begged not to go on with his project because of the fact that it would incense a great many people and at the same time accomplish no tangible good of any kind, inasmuch as there was really nothing to expose. There was nothing involved which could have the slightest political significance or have the slightest effect upon the fate of the nation or any other broad issue. But if we are to carry the concept carried in this book, the idea became more or less of an obsession. This man was convinced that he was born for the purpose of revealing secrets. And even though after he revealed them they caused no particular stir and no excitement to speak of, he felt that he simply had to reveal them. Now, he's not alone in this type of thing. Practically every secret society, benevolent or otherwise, has been exposed many times. And for the most part, everyone has been a little angry at the person who broke his obligations, but for the most part, there's been no serious tragedies or anything of an exceptionally outstanding nature. But due to the general prevailing temper, which is the same kind of temper which resulted in the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, the Mormon leader who was assassinated for having created a new faith in America, or the assassination or execution of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, these kind of feelings were running strong in those days, and these comparatively illiberal people felt that the slightest deviation from tradition was a hideous offense which must be appropriately punished. The story is that after the preparation of his expose, Captain Morgan, an effort was made to spirit him into Canada. He was abducted, and according to final belief, he had rocks tied around his body, and he was thrown into the Niagara River near Lake Ontario, and therefore died by assassination or by murder, if you wish to come out and call it such. Later, his body was identified, at least in part, and the anti-Masonic group at that time made a tremendous furor over the whole thing. Now, this seems to have been a more or less closed issue. Everyone gradually forgot about it. No one knew too much about it to begin with. Facts were few and opinions were many, and gossip was continuous. But what really happened seems to have been rather mysterious. There was no real certainty, apart from very largely perjured testimony, that anything of a particularly unpleasant nature actually happened to Morgan. Maybe something did, maybe something didn't. Those who wanted to believe it were always able to manufacture a story. But everything had died down long before the basic information contained in the book Etidorhpa had any interest to anyone. But with the publication of the book, the entire subject took on a very interesting and dramatic coloring. And in connection with this, I can only mention that it is rather clearly keyed in the text, became one of the great centers of controversy in all the publicity, book reviews, and other matters relating to Etidorhpa at the time of the publication of the book itself, and has been a lingering concept ever since, and that according to Mr. Knapp, he was convinced that Mr. Lloyd actually believed that the true author of Etidorhpa was Captain William Morgan. That this book was written many years after the supposed death of Captain Morgan. Mr. Knapp, who made the various portraitures contained in the book, was unable at the time he made the pictures to secure a photograph or a likeness or a picture of Morgan, because, as might be expected, they were rather rare, because even the daguerreotype was not available. But later he was able to find an old picture, and he says that to his utter astonishment, the face of the mysterious man in Etidorhpa was identically the face of Captain William Morgan. If this account has any weight, it adds the second link to our mysterious chain of events, because it would explain the opening part of the book and would intimate that the so-called murder of Captain Morgan did not occur, but that Morgan was placed under a penalty, and that this penalty became the subject of the book Etidorhpa. Now, as we go into the book itself, as many people realize, we have throughout its text occasional direct references to Masonic rituals and symbols. There are several places in which statements are made that are obviously derived directly from ritual. Therefore, there is every implication in the book that the original author or authors wished it to be considered as having Masonic significance. Of this there can be no doubt. Just to what degree this Masonic significance is valid is again one of the mysteries surrounding Etidorhpa. The book goes into considerable detail, as we will later notice, relating to the so-called abduction of a man at a time and under circumstances which make it appear almost certain that Captain William Morgan is intended. We now pass into an entirely new sphere. The abduction of Morgan, the circumstances involving the possibility that he survived and that he remained hidden for one reason or another for a long period of time, such ideas, such circumstances, do not necessarily tax our imagination to any overwhelming degree. But we move from this into something in which the science fiction element begins to appear. The contents of the book, as far as its story is concerned, has to come under one of three headings. Either it is a factual experience utterly beyond belief. Second, it is a complete work of fiction using historical circumstances for a springboard, or else the entire work is essentially allegorical. Now, there is every possibility that the whole book is a very ingenious piece of symbolism, and that there is no part of it, with perhaps the exception of the early parts or its early chapters, that are even intended to be taken literally. That it actually, instead of being the story of the journey of a man to a mysterious region, that it is actually the story of the journey of man through a mysterious universe, the universe in which he now lives. And the universe is unfolded for him very much in the spirit of the Eleusinian and Mithraic rites of ancient Greece and Persia. There is a thin veiling by means of which it would be possible, if penetrated through this veil, to assume that the whole story represents a restoration and reveal it to us rather as the adventure of a person passing through the conditions of his own internal life. Such a concept is highly possible, and Mr. Knapp gave it a lot of thought and said that certainly, if the story was not factually true to the end, then it must certainly be symbolically significant or important. That the story may have had unknown authors entirely different from any that we know is not incredible or impossible. But Mr. Knapp, whose early association with Lloyd and with practically all the persons involved, who personally knew Llewyllyn Drury, the original custodian of the manuscript, and Mr. Knapp said that on several occasions he actually examined the original manuscript in the autograph of the unknown author. All of these circumstances, of course, led Knapp to assume that there might be a very literal meaning. That this literal meaning, however, could drift into allegory, and from a certain foundation, we might move to the realization that this was the story of the actual inner experience of Captain William Morgan in the years following his realization that he had made, at least in his time, a serious mistake. This possibility also implying that the author had learned something of the greatest importance as far as his own moral and ethical life were concerned. Now, there is one other element which we also have to mention in connection with the story of Etidorhpa, because we are trying to summarize a very big subject. And how big it is, you will only know if you make a very careful study of the book. The story has certain basic scientific interest. This has led some people to suspect that the scientific facts contained in the work would be possibly reminiscent of the personal and chosen career of John Uri Lloyd. He was a man who might have possessed this knowledge himself. This is true. It is never possible to know just how much knowledge anyone possesses, and it is quite possible that as a serious and scholarly individual, he had come to certain conclusions concerning essential principles of knowledge, which would have been rather difficult for him to transmit literally without bringing down upon himself a terrible condemnation, but which presented in a semi-fictional manner might intrigue the mind and cause the reader to perhaps investigate for himself somewhat further than he would otherwise have done. One fragment of this scientific knowledge, probably the most important fragment, if we can call it such, would be the background or the environment in which a large part of the story is laid. This environment lies beneath the surface of the earth. If this environment be regarded as a serious and solemn effort to understand the construction of the subterranean regions beneath the earth's surface, then Mr. Lloyd was either a man of great imagination or a prophet of unusually good parts. Actually, today, in the world of semi-science, in the world of science fiction, we are gaining an increasing number of accounts of the possible existence of regions beneath the Earth's surface that are rather different from those which our geologists might first assume to be there. One of the interesting angles of this story is that it follows through a kind of mysterious inter-earth cosmogony, something happening beneath the Earth's surface, a little reminiscent of Dante's journey through the Inferno. Dante's journey into an underworld we know to have been a great political satire, one of the most brutal and at the same time most dramatic in the history of human literature. Yet in order to create this world of his Inferno and his Paradiso, Dante actually fabricated a complete concept of the universe. He formed a very profound concept of the stratification and structure of the earth beneath its surface. He built this scheme so perfectly and so completely that when he used it, he was able to make a very logical unfoldment, step by step, of this underworld construction, as we find Dante presumably being led through the Inferno by his guide, Virgil. In through the book, at a number of points, are introduced scientific experiments. Most of them are extremely simple, and they were advanced originally in an effort to convince Llewyllyn Drury of the honesty and accuracy of certain statements to which he took offense. The original author of the manuscript asked Mr. Drury to ponder the various sections well, and if a question arose or a doubt arose as to the truth of these statements, particularly those of a scientific nature, he was to state this doubt, and the original author would attempt to solve it for him. In each case where a doubt was raised, the mysterious author did meet the doubt and solved it to the point where at least Mr. Drury was unable to argue any further. Many of the points involved, such as the demonstration of the possibility of seeing your own brain, or the demonstration, for example, of water rising above its own level, and things of that nature seemed incredible. But by very simple experiments which are set forth in detail in the book and can be copied by anyone, the truth of the statements was proved or objectively demonstrated. There are many statements, therefore, which can be checked, and these statements were certainly inconsistent with the general thinking of the time, although perhaps some of them are not as astonishing to us as they would have been to the reader in 1895. Actually, also, there is a peculiar line of semi-bitterness running underneath the surface of the book. It indicates a person who is a little more than merely a wandering character in an underworld, as in the case of Dante and his Inferno. Here we have a man in Etidorhpa who obviously carries a very definite chip on his shoulder concerning scientific attitudes, scientific methods, and scientific learning. He practically states, to be an essential formula, that whatever science states on any subject, the reverse will ultimately prove to be true. That we are approaching knowledge far too superficially. He makes a number of statements. He develops one theme at considerable length, which is reminiscent of our more recent discoveries in vitamins, something at that time not generally considered. The mysterious author, for example, points out that if we take any food that we know and commonly use, and we analyze it, and we get the chemical formula which is contained in that food, then we go to a pharmaceutical house or a drugstore or anywhere else and buy those chemicals. And then we put them together in a jar or a bottle in exactly the proportion that they appear in the original foodstuff. And then drink the formula. One of several things may happen. The first thing is that nothing will happen. The second is that we will become deathly sick. And the third thing possible is that we will kill ourselves. We will kill ourselves from the exact formula of food which in its proper and reasonable form maintains life. From this basic thinking, the author of the book points out that what we call nutrition is not merely man taking into his system materials derived from other forms in nature, that these forms are all of them merely catalysts for agents which we do not understand, do not know, and which we cannot copy artificially, and that therefore it is not the food or the formula of the food, but something else that has to be present, and that this invisible something else is a pure life substance which cannot be artificially manufactured, will not result from the compounding of known elements or substances, but is placed there and is present there by the alchemy of nature, which man cannot reproduce. This was one of the points which he established in his book, which no doubt would have been known, at least potentially, by John Uri Lloyd, or could have been speculatively contemplated by him. Thus, there are a number of these little episodes which might suggest the trained physicist or the trained chemist. But there are others in which no amount of training, such as we have today, would in any way explain the mystery of the subject. So we have many different elements and factors involved and combined to make this a very curious and difficult book. That parts of it are utterly fantastic, we cannot deny. One of the points which perhaps we must also give a moment to is this inter-earth cosmogony, if we want to call it so. According to the concept as set forth by Etidorhpa, the Earth's interior parts should not be regarded as we generally think of them. Science fiction today has many parallel stories of worlds under the earth, of people living there, of all kinds of things happening there. Now, to a measure, Etidorhpa follows some of these, but in a rather reduced manner, a rather epitomized form. Etidorhpa does not, generally speaking, go into the idea of a great civilization existing under the earth. That is not part of the concept. Part of the concept apparently is that there are regions under the earth, that these regions have some mysterious relationship with the earth's surface, that things happening below the surface are in many instances the causes of things occurring on the surface, that there are motions from within the earth by means of which great changes and conditions arise upon the surface of the earth, that there are explanations beneath the earth's surface for most of the things that happen up above, and that these happenings are a motion from a within outward. Now let us assume for a moment that there could be a highly symbolical interpretation of this book, and that we are supposed to recognize the story of the adventure as a person forced into his own inner life, either by conscience or by necessity, that he moves from the surface of his own nature, which for the average person would be his earth surface. And many times in the book this is intimated. And it's one of the confusing points, because one moment it seems almost certain that we are dealing with a psychological story. Some of the more extravagant parts of the story are actually introduced as dream circumstances occurring to this person under the earth. He is not only under the earth, but also subjected to dream circumstances. But if we should imagine for a moment that by some mysterious route, as indicated in the story, at least figuratively, the individual moves from his own externity, his own outer life, toward an internal state of himself. Or we might say that a person banished by punishment, losing the association of his fellow men, must then develop his own resources in order to survive. And like Robinson Crusoe cast away on a desert island, whose adventures became the basis of the whole concept of modern philosophic humanism, we have in this story the possibility of a man going inside. And instead of finding the inside of his life to be merely composed of bones, muscles, and organs, he gradually comes to realize that there is within him an unperceived supersubstantial universe, that there is a world inside of him, just exactly as there is a world around him in nature. The difference being, as the book would intimate, that this world inside of him is forever moving toward the surface. This would be good psychology. That from the strange underworld of his own subconscious and unconscious, from the strange regions of his own psychic experiences, from his fears, frights, and longings, which are very clearly set forth in the story, the individual can symbolically experience an investigation of his own soul. That his own inner psyche is therefore a strange and mysterious world with many levels and stratifications, but that most of all this internal world is bound to the external, and that the external world is a kind of efflorescence of it, that as certain lime forms on the surface of stone, being exuded from the stone itself, so the surface of the earth is exuded from its inner invisible body. And the temperament, disposition, appearance, characteristic, and attitude of man is something exuded from his own soul, passing outward into his body, and from this into objective manifestation. If we assume this, we are very close, perhaps, to an understanding of a part of the story. This becomes much more dominant after the hero of the story meets Etidorhpa. Now, Etidorhpa, as you probably have already noticed, is nothing but the word Aphrodite spelt backwards. And Aphrodite was the ancient goddess of love. and in the story of Etidorhpa appears as the redeeming power of love. Now, traveling inward through a series of psychic experiences, it would be quite conceivable that man might discover the inward power of love over the life that he outwardly leads. It would represent truly a transformation of the very hate which perhaps at one time caused this man to attempt to work this injury upon his friends. Furthermore, however, as we go on, we find that the hero of the story ultimately reaches what he calls the end of earth. Now, the end of earth, in this case, is a kind of jumping-off place, a place from which he can step, as from the edge of a great cliff. But once he has stepped into this infinity, he steps into an absoluteness that is beyond description, beyond analysis, beyond recording. Therefore, as the hero of the book explains it, the story ends with the end of earth. When he has to go beyond this point, he goes to a place of no return. If he goes beyond this point, he goes to a condition utterly undescribable by man, into a condition of absoluteness, which, however, as described in the book, takes on many of the dimensions and aspects and values of the ancient Buddhistic concept of nirvana. The place to which he would go is the place of absolute peace, of absolute rest, and a place which he can attain only by the total renunciation of himself. This again leads us into the suspicion that we are dealing with a pageantry of initiation into the mysteries. Also that in this indescribable ultimate state of things, he is sustained by having passed through practically all of the zones and belts in which the various laws of nature operate. The book is strongly grounded in the concept of natural law. There is no effort to violate or to distort natural law. Actually, the individual throughout the whole of the mysterious journey is journeying in law and with law. It is law that makes it all possible. But it is also law interpreted very differently from the way we interpret it. It is law not merely a cold fact, but a living reality. It is law not only in the sense of inevitables and immutables that bind us to concepts. It is a law, an eternal principle, in which it moves all things inevitably and eternally toward union with itself. And this union is a condition greatly to be desired. Only one more element remains in the story to discuss beforehand, and that is the mysterious guide who plays the part of Virgil to the story hero. I'm not going to describe him for you because I think the impact of his description, as represented in the pictures drawn by Mr. Knapp, will give you a much more charming introduction. But he represents undoubtedly another element in the story. He represents a factor. He represents a type of motivation, something which has power because it is lacking in something. A specialized and very curious and strange kind of existence. An existence belonging to a region that we do not understand, but an existence which would imply release from the bondage of sensory perception, which might be very appropriate and very necessary, shall we say, to the mysticism of this story. We can't do much more because we will now have to rush through and show you these pictures, and we'll try to explain certain of the points to you as we go along. But I think that you will realize as we proceed that we are dealing indeed with a very strange sometimes apparently ridiculous, often profoundly stimulating a situation. Something that is perhaps without parallel in literature. And to many persons who have spent, as Mr. Knapp did, many years trying to check it and study it, perhaps not paralleled in basic scientific or esoteric meaning. So I think we will first of all introduce our subject with the original portrait that Mr. Knapp made of the hero of the book, who is recorded only under one curious title, I Am the Man. Now, having this gentleman appear unexpectedly in your midst might be quite a shock to almost anyone. This man is exactly as described in the manuscript, and the sketch for this picture was originally left with the manuscript. Later, however, it was improved by Mr. Knapp through his study, and also later proved to be, with the exception of the hair and beard, an almost exact likeness of Captain William Morgan. The peculiar prominent part being the exceedingly high forehead, which apparently was a distinguishing factor in the original account. When this man first made his appearance to Llewyllyn Drury, he simply, Drury asked him his name. He said, I will never tell you my name. You may know me only as I am the man who did it. And that is the only name by which he was recorded in the book. And it is this man who is held to have been the original author of the book. And this is the man who Mr. Knapp saw on the street in Cincinnati. Now it seems that Mr. Llewyllyn Drury, here shown in his vest, was of a peculiar, rather introspective nature himself. He was living alone, and one evening, as he was in his study, he contemplated a line from Cicero, never less alone than when alone. He said to himself, this is ridiculous. When you are alone, you are very much alone. And at that moment, a voice said, I think you're wrong. And he turned suddenly, and here was this man sitting in a chair in his living room. He had never seen him before. He knew nothing about him. But this man said that he had come to Llewyllyn Drury to ask him a real and particular favor, that he would become the custodian of this manuscript. When the manuscript later, for there was a year between the first visit and the continuance of the discussion, when the manuscript finally appeared, it was so miserably written that Drury couldn't read it. So the hero thereof and the author thereof agreed to read the manuscript to Drury, a procedure which took a considerable time and which became the basis of the story as it is unfolded in the book. However, as Mr. Lloyd points out, one of the reasons why the book was changed in many parts to different editions for years was the fact that some of the original manuscript was so bad that it took experts to decode it sufficiently to know what was said, and a number of amendments and corrections were necessary. And also, I Am the Man himself ordered or required corrections after the first edition of the book was printed. Here is the second illustration as set. Here is the mysterious man asking Mr. Drury, and according to John Uri Lloyd and Mr. Knapp, the picture of Mr. Drury is from a likeness and is accurate. That I Am the Man insisted that this trust be kept and begged Mr. Drury to agree to take the manuscript and hold it for the 30 years as required. After considerable persuasion, Mr. Drury agreed, and on the occasion of the agreement, they shook hands and more or less promised to be mutually faithful in this trust. This is the scene where I Am the Man gets the promise from Mr. Drury that he will do the work as ordered. The next morning, Mr. Drury, waking from sleep, decides he's had a nightmare. He does not believe that the mysterious person was ever there, but going to his library table in the morning, he finds on the table one of the long hairs from the man's beard. This was really quite difficult, and later caused him to be suspected of psychic aberrations by one of the brilliant scientists of the period, Dr. Vaughan, who was also a real person, and who also admitted that Mr. Drury had come to him with the exact story as narrated in the book, the discovery of the mysterious hair. Later we find indications that I Am the Man had persuasive means when need arose. Mr. Drury became more and more concerned and unsettled and unhappy over the transaction in its earlier stages, and finally I Am the Man drew this knife and threatened Drury unless he agreed to keep the promise which he had made. The presence of the knife was very persuasive. There was never any need to use it. But Drury realized then that he was dealing with a man who was determined to have his own way, and that the best thing to do was to acquiesce as gracefully as possible. Here, I Am the Man threatens Drury unless he keeps the promise that he has made. Before leaving the room on that occasion, the mysterious man went over to the doorknob and cut a cross of 2 strokes crossing each other in the doorknob. Mr. Knapp went to Llewyllyn Drury's apartment, saw the room in which the episode had occurred, and saw the 2 deep slashes in the brass doorknob. At the time when Mr. Knapp visited the place, those then residing there did not know anything about the reason for the slashes in the doorknob. But the knife, or whatever it was that made those slashes, cut through a 1/4 inch of brass without the slightest difficulty. And Knapp insists that he saw these marks, which I Am the Man placed there in order that Drury would never be inclined to suspect that the whole thing was a nightmare. If the occasion itself was not a nightmare, the writing was. Here is an example of the original handwriting of I Am the Man. It ran into hundreds of pages like this, and required a great deal of care and thought. Parts of it are not too difficult to read, but areas of it where words of somewhat similar shape and different meanings occur, they're extremely confusing, and was only, as Mr. Lloyd said, after working with the manuscript for several months, that he was able to read it with even reasonable ease. This manuscript is not in the handwriting of Lloyd, nor in the handwriting of Llewyllyn Drury. There is no indication that it is a doctored handwriting. It is simply the handwriting of a person who was not particularly skilled in writing, which would have applied to the original character as he describes his own circumstances. This is the account that is found in the book of Etidorhpa of the abduction of this man as the result of his determination to write this mysterious expose of a secret society. He wrote the work in this cabin, and the cabin was seen and photographed later, and I saw Mr. Knapp's photographs of the cabin. At night, 3 gentlemen waited upon the man who did it, perhaps alias Captain Morgan. And it was at that time that they led him forth into the mysterious world in which all things became meaningless in terms of common sense. We know definitely and beyond any reasonable doubt that the story of these happenings has no place in the sober story of Freemasonry. It has to deal with something that even from this point on begins to take on strange and esoteric implications. It is quite possible that these three men themselves represent symbolic factors in the drama, for this number and the circumstances occurs quite frequently in Masonic symbolism. At the time it occurred, according to the story, Morgan was not an old man, but as the result of being taken into a remote place and subjected to certain mystical, metaphysical, and alchemical treatments, he was suddenly prematurely aged. He was aged so rapidly that his identity was hopelessly obscured, and that no one would ever be able to recognize his original nature when it was changed in this way. This change was not due to makeup. Something was done that actually aged him. This aging, of course, however, if you want to go back to the symbolic system of thought, we can assume that it was life in its various episodes that aged him. That therefore, he was gradually being separated from a world from which we are all separated by age. And that even though symbolically it would have seemed to have occurred in a single night, it is not also true that in our way of thinking in terms of eternity, the life of man with his natural physical aging is but an instant. But by this aging, I am the man was separated forever from the world he had known. Is not this also a possible philosophic truth? That through aging we lose contact gradually with things that were previously real to us, and that our own inner lives become unknowable to even those who previously held us in close acquaintance. In any event, this mysterious aging prepared him for the next step of his strange journey. Later, in an effort to restore contact with his family and friends, he was permitted by the mysterious gentleman in the tall hat in the background to visit the community in which he lived. Here he met persons that he had known before, but none of them knew him. And every effort that he made to try to prove to them his previous identity failed utterly. They were unwilling to accept in this aged man a young man of only a short time before. They insisted that it was madness, that there was no possibility of it being the same person, so that he was unable to go back, that he was unable to restore his relationship with the world he had left behind. Now, there are possible explanations to this also. If this aging should be regarded as an exterior symbol of some kind of an internal growth or change, we might also say that the individual, once having outgrown a certain condition of life, cannot return to it again. And once we have outgrown a certain concept of life, we cannot return to it. Age causes changes in our psychology. We know this because if in later years we go back to childhood homes and places we have known, we have no fond desire to stay there. Something has happened. And in the experience which happened to this man, he was separated from the old way by a series of circumstances that were moving him into a new and mysterious direction. Now, at the time when it was supposed that William Morgan was being taken across the Niagara River to his reported doom, according to Etidorhpa's story, he was placed in a carriage and driven along a very long road for many days, leading downward from the original seat of the occurrence through Illinois and down into Kentucky. He crossed the Ohio River, and this is a reconstructed map that was made from the records and finally became the guide by which Mr. Knapp was able to relocate the mysterious cavern through which our hero is said to have descended into the underworld. This cavern is not the Great Kentucky Cave, but it is in a somewhat similar kind of structure and formation, and it is located in that general area. And these different numbers relate to places where Mr. Knapp and others checked on the story, because in the story there is brief mention of passing certain communities, going through certain towns, passing by certain farms or certain formations of land. These have all been checked, and as far as this checking is possible, they were all physically true. Now, in order to gain a little further understanding of this, we pause for a moment to reconstruct from photographs taken by Mr. Knapp during his researches the countryside and the general region in which these cavernous places are located. Here are photographs taken by Mr. Knapp in the area of the final location of the mysterious cave described in the story. You can see the rather wonderful and amazing surface formations, which to the geologists do intimate that the areas beneath might be honeycombed, very much like the area of the Great Kentucky Cave. These are views taken in and around the general area where the drama begins to take on its greatest intensity. Here is a site leading into one of these caves. And the difficulty that Mr. Knapp had at the beginning was to discover which one of the caverns was the one actually referred to in the story. He was finally able to identify it by certain landmarks literally given in the book. Now the question is, did John Uri Lloyd ever go here? We have no record that he did. Had he any way of knowing about this, other than perhaps in a purely empiric manner? We do not know that he did. Persons living in the area were never questioned by him. They were never interrogated by him, because in an area such as this, any effort that he had made would have been almost immediately the subject of local gossip and tradition. Knapp went through the region a few years after the book was published. There was no one there who had any memory of anyone ever having asked them before, or have tried to use guides as he did to try to locate the areas. So we have no indication that Mr. Lloyd had any such understanding or knowledge. Here is the river or stream that flows out of one of the caverns. In fact, we're getting very close to the cavern involved. This stream has a subterranean origin and comes out and grows in this wonderful, wild, and verdant region. It is a beautiful country, and a country that is filled with old lore and beliefs, some of them tracing back to the American Indian period in this region, and some of them quite fantastic. There is much of the lore that seems to have a bearing on the story. Here you see the actual entrance to the cave of Etidorhpa. It was finally and completely identified. And it was not identified by the entrance alone, but by the construction inside, which follows a very definite and particular pattern. There is, in connection with this cave, not only its surface openings, but there are a series of vents in the ceiling of the cave which go up to the surface of the ground. These vents and their location made it possible to identify the mysterious region. And here, in the due course of time, I Am the Man was deposited by the mysterious persons in the dark carriage that thundered through the night, carrying him a third of the way at that time across the nation. A very difficult and circuitous route, made more difficult by the obvious intention of those driving to make certain that they could not be followed, or that the exact location they were reaching could not be anticipated or their tracks retraced at a later time. And it was here that, according to the story, Llewyllyn, I Am the Man, met his guide. This guide climbed up through one of the vents and was a person completely without eyes. Now this story ties very closely with, of course, a phenomena that is known in the Kentucky caves. For there are in these caves fish that are eyeless. Having lived always underground in darkness, these fish have in the course of time lost even the rudimentary trace of eyes. This mysterious being was apparently human, yet not human, having no eyes and no temperature to the body, being cold and forever wet. Yet this person was the one that was appointed to lead I Am the Man on his long and difficult journey. He was entrusted to this guide with the admonition that he was about to enter into a strange and almost incredible cycle of punishments. Punishments, however, which were not of malice, but punishments to represent the inevitable path of the truth seeker, seeking to compensate for the sins of his life. That in some mysterious way every human being has to purge his body of his own ignorance, has to make right the innumerable wrongs, because every human being who has not an illumined inner life is betraying something, whether he knows it or not. And this process of betraying truth is that of ignorance, the individual who makes these basic mistakes from which the experience of growth or the journey into his own inner consciousness by this eyeless guide is his own only hope. The eyelessness of this guide seems to suggest something that never comes to the surface of his life at all, therefore has no need of the senses and faculties with which the average person regulates his affairs. It is possible that by this eyeless guide is meant intuition, or some mysterious superphysical faculty, which is important in man's journey to the inner self. Oh, we're going to have to do that one again. This is even a little more than can be anticipated in this story. Here is the point in which I Am the Man reaches his last contact with the outside world. He is standing under a vent which goes like a chimney up to the surface of the earth and down which the ray of the sun passes. Now, this was the final clue by means of which Mr. Knapp was able to locate the exact cave. He entered the cabin, followed a long and difficult road, as indicated, wading in water, much of it up to his waist or more, until he finally came to this point. He stood exactly where I Am the Man is standing in this picture, looked up and saw the opening above, and he then knew that the next step was that he had to dive under a partition of rock. In those days, when he wanted to do this, we did not have the equipment we have now, which would have made it a simple fact. If he had dived under this bridge of rock and had not found what I Am the Man found, he could easily have died there. He could have not been able to get back. He might have found himself trapped in a situation beyond his control. Mr. Knapp never quite had the courage to make that dive under the ledge, but he got this far. He also sounded with a sounding cord and a lead weight. His cord was 300 feet long. He could not reach bottom. From right below the point where these figures stand, the under cliff beneath the water drops away to immeasurable depth. So Mr. Knapp stood here and then turned sadly back, always expecting or hoping, however, that someday he would be able to go on into this other region. That there was some physical point to the story up to this point, Mr. Knapp was certain. Whether this was derived from other sources, who got the information and how it was put into the book, he does not know. but he does know that to this point there is a literal, if also symbolical, story involved. Now here you have further experimentation and research in the structures in the under part of the cave, going along to the point where he finally could dare go no further. He found formations of this kind. Formations that suggest always in their stalactite and stalagmite form that they are part of a great system of underground openings or hollows. Here is one example of a photograph taken in the central part of this cave before the final stepping off point. Now, after he had gone through this underwater bridge and had come up again, guided by his mysterious guide, I Am the Man found himself in a world of fungus. He found himself in a world of mushrooms and other similar things growing down under the earth. That these forms were very much larger than anything to be found on the earth's surface. And according to the guide who was with him, the reason was that these forms were more or less archetypal, and that when these forms finally pressed through the earth and came into the non-tranquil atmosphere of the earth, and came under the pressure of atmosphere, their forms were immediately reduced. But that therefore, beneath the earth, these forms have a great deal more abundance than they have upon the surface. Also, I Am the Man made the discovery that in this region in which he was being led by his eyeless guide, there was a kind of light that this eyeless person could see. But he did not see with his eyes. He saw with his mind. And that instead of this light being derived from the direct ray of the sun, that it was a diffused light. And his guide also explained to him that all light, all true light, is invisible. And that what we call light is merely energy or life motion made visible by its contact with atmosphere. This is sustained to the degree that as we ascend into outer space, we ascend into darkness even in the daytime. But according to this story, the under part of the earth is also filled with light energy. And this light energy has a luminance of its own without a center. There is no sunrise and no sunset. There is merely a continuous luminance of a light which has its actual origin in the earth rather than in the sun. The eyeless guide and his mysterious companion then continue on their way down through these caverns. And as they proceed, other things happen. One of the things that happens, for example, is that I Am the Man discovered that gradually he ate less often. He discovered, for example, that hunger is due to a certain kind of energy expenditure, and that if this energy expenditure is not the same as it is on the earth's surface, that his appetite is not the same. He also discovered that the temperature of his body changed. And as he progressed further downward until, according to the account, he was nearly 10 miles beneath the surface of the earth, he found that nearly everything that was familiar to him on the surface was no longer existent. He also learned gradually that he passed through the barrier of gravity, and that the gravity problem under the earth is very different from what it is on the surface. His study in the effects of gravity also involved, finally, his energy displacement. It would have been very difficult for him to have walked any great distance in our atmosphere, but without weight and without energy displacement, he found that it was possible to travel incredible distances without fatigue or without hardly realizing that he was traveling at all. Here he is moving downward through these mysterious caves in which grotesque and strange forms appear. This journey is very reminiscent of the Mithraic caverns used in the mysteries, for always in the ancient rites, the candidate was conducted into a subterranean region, whether it be the house of Osiris in Amentet, or whether it be the subterranean cave of the nymphs, as described by Homer, or whether it had been the mysteries performed in the catacombs under Rome. Always the rites of initiation were given in a lower or so-called infernal region. As they proceeded further along this mysterious journey, they found these mountains of salt, and the guide explained to him that these mountains of salt resulted from the gradual departure of water, that the water moved up and left the salt. This was one of the questions later that Llewyllyn Drury demanded an explanation for, assuming that the description as given by I Am the Man was not scientifically possible. In a small experiment set forth in the book, which anyone could perform for 25 cents worth of equipment, I Am the Man shows that this departure of the water from the salt in this way, without evaporation, is possible. Because in this region there can be no evaporation. And because of these different atmospheric situations, most of the laws, as we know them, of nature, appear to be completely reversed. Here we have the beginning of experiments with gravity. Here we find that the under earth, like the outer space, gradually defies gravity, that the body becomes comparatively weightless, and that as a result of this, motion is quite different. Motion is impelled no longer by moving of the legs or stepping one foot in front of the other. Motion is almost simply a willing to move. The individual sort of throws himself into motion, and his entire nature moves accordingly. According to the story, our hero found that he could jump a 10 or 15 foot crevasse without the slightest difficulty, and that in jumping a foot in the air under earthly conditions, he would now bound up 8 or 10 feet. In science fiction, we begin to find similar accounts of the rarefied situation outside of the Earth's surface, and that therefore in these projectiles and so forth, when we get beyond gravity, we will be weightless. Here, according to Lloyd's book, or Lloyd's description, you have a double situation of this kind. You have a loss of gravity pull on the outside, and you also have a loss of gravity pull on the inside. The indication being very definitely, namely that gravity is used in this case probably to represent egocentricity. Here the individual finds that he is no longer bound by the pull of his own self-entity, that he achieves freedom, as in the East Indian magic. He is able to neutralize gravity by neutralizing the power of self-centeredness, that actually gravity for man is largely the focusing of his attention upon himself. This point is very carefully studied with scientific addenda. Now, in the course of their great under-earth exploration, the man who did it and his mysterious eyeless guide come to the shores of an incredible sea. This sea extends on and on and on. But the thing that is astonishing about it is that it is absolutely without motion. There are no tides. There is no ripple. There is no motion of air. Everything is locked within the great bell of the earth. Therefore, everything is in a state of complete repose, absolute silence. This becomes a very intriguing and dramatic situation, and again causes us to suspect that the author is telling us that we are approaching the sea of internal consciousness. Here, standing upon a rock, looking out over this vast expanse of the unknown, the individual finds that in his inner life there is this placid ocean, this ocean of Tao, this mysterious, unchanging water of eternity, this sea which is perhaps the one referred to by Edward Arnold in his great story, The Light of Asia, where he says, "Om Mani Padma, whom the daybreak comes, and the dewdrop slips back into the shining sea." The sea in this case being the total consciousness of the being. And man, as an intellectual entity, contemplating this, must be led there by his blinded senses. In other words, the fact that the external senses are in some way blocked, as represented by the eyeless guide, makes possible the awakening or stimulation of the interior sensory powers. And was now on the edge of a great sea which leads he knows not where, and on the edge are these great cliffs rising up, but he is not able to be sure whether this sea is water or glass. Perhaps this is also the Shemayim of the ancient Kabbalah, where it says in Genesis, "For the waters which were above the firmament were divided from the waters which were beneath the firmament." Now this is a very peculiar statement, and most Bible students haven't done much with it. But it applies apparently to the fact that there are two oceans, one above and one below. Now this representing perhaps a mysterious under-ocean, a sea of shining glass, a mysterious region that is uncontaminated by the surface tides or by the winds of circumstance. If man's consciousness is freed from the winds of his emotions and his opinions, it too may become a placid sea, full of mystery and incredible depths. Now this is one of the sketches that was made by Mr. Knapp to illustrate Etidorhpa, and which was rejected by I Am the Man. This therefore did not appear in the book, the illustration previously shown taking its place. Here the illusion or the mystery of ships, a kind of a Sargasso Sea, in which these ships were held and captured as in death. This thought, according to Mr. Knapp, was his first interpretation of the original meaning, that this sea was more or less a place that locked and held everything, that it was a graveyard of all ships, that it was the end of all things, the graveyard of man. Perhaps it was the misunderstanding that we also have in Buddhism, that nirvana is the graveyard of existence, that all things end in it, that it represents only oblivion, that like some story of the ancient mariner, we were faced by this wonderful but terrible fate of the painted ship upon the painted ocean. But I Am the Man corrected the picture, said no, this sea is not a graveyard of ancient ships. This sea is a mystery, moving placidly forever, but not corrupted by any element of death. It does not dissolve death into itself. It simply is forever. But it is also without menace, without danger. It has none of the horrors of a sea which will destroy life. The surface ocean of man's emotions may wreck the ship of his life, but deep within, the silent ocean of consciousness is never moved by the changes which take place in the outer surface of his existence. So the picture was rejected. Now, in the midst of his receiving various elements of this story, our friend Llewyllyn Drury found himself pretty much beyond his depth. So we went over and had a talk with one of the learned men of Cincinnati in that time, and that was Professor Vaughan. Now, Professor Vaughan was a real person. This is an accurate portrait representation of him. He was a deep and eccentric man, rather learned, progressive for his time, but as the story given him by Drury unfolded, it was obvious that Vaughan was completely beyond his depth. Vaughan, however, did admit certain things. Vaughan, in the story at least, becomes the foil, inasmuch as he reveals the ignorance of knowledge. Vaughan acknowledges to Llewyllyn Drury that all these facts we have, all this knowledge that we claim to know, rests upon the insecure foundation of hypothesis. He uses the example of ether, the scientific hypothetical medium, not the ether of anesthesia, but the ether of space. He shows how science, in order to explain things otherwise not to be explained, has been forced to invent something which it cannot explain after it has invented it. That man, in order to rationalize his own opinions, has had to support them by a series of artificial intellectual inventions. That these inventions are not facts, but if we accept the invention, we can then establish a fact. If we reject, however, the invention, there is no fact. And that nearly all knowledge that we possess of any subject rests upon some mysterious, dark, hidden footing that we cannot see, that we cannot know, and that we cannot be certain of. And that even when we possess a high degree of knowledge, so that we are able to demonstrate, perhaps even with Einsteinian mathematical precision, the fact of something, that even this precise knowledge, of course, Dr. Vaughan didn't know Einstein, but we know the principle he was working with. Namely, that when we have established an irrefutable fact and find that there appears to be no way of undermining or questioning that fact, the time will corrode it away. That perhaps what we have will prove to be true, but only a part of the truth. And that each day we outgrow what we believe to be total truth, until finally, if we are wise and intelligent beings, we will relinquish the hope of immediate total truth on a scientific level. That we cannot hope to attain it, because there is too much around us and within us that is simply unknown. Now, if we take Dr. Vaughan, Professor Vaughan's philosophy, and apply our present story to it, and it is probably inserted at the point where it is placed for a reason, then it perhaps might imply that this mysterious underworld, from which I am the man returned to give his manuscript to Drury, could represent this substratum of unknown fact, this something that has to be there, but which no one can prove or demonstrate. That this underworld is the underground of knowing, this mysterious dark earth from which all things come, this strange elos or slime from which life comes, for life moving upward from some strange, recondite, hidden source of itself, rises from the dark underworld. And in the story, the underworld through which I am the man journeys is like a great egg or a great seed, and contains within its mysterious sections and parts the germs which rise into knowing, or into observing, or into contemplation. So we find poor Dr. Vaughan is much embarrassed, but he is honest enough to admit that while he cannot justify or even explain rationally the imponderables that Drury brings to him, that he must admit in all fairness that we do not have the answers which Drury seeks, those answers which would disprove the story of the man who did it. Now, because of the fact that gravity has practically ceased to exist, our eyeless guide is able to carry this comparatively large boat without difficulty and to place it in this subterranean sea. Now, if you remember back into the mysteries of Osiris in Egypt, you remember the strange island in the midst of the invisible subterranean Nile that flowed under the temples of Luxor, Karnak, and Memphis, and that this island was reached by means of a boat that was always in the underworld and was rowed by a blind oarsman. Now that we find in the Egyptian mysteries and in certain phases of the ancient Egyptian ritual of Memphis. Therefore, we have now a blind guide with a boat in the underworld, which is going to carry I am the man in a mysterious journey across the sea of life. All of this ritualizes very easily and indicates that perhaps there is a master scheme or master plan behind the entire account. Among the other experiments which were made one day while I am the man was reading his manuscript to Llewyllyn Drury, was one relating to the possibility of seeing your own brain. Now, as a footnote to the story in Etidorhpa, it is noted that this particular discovery was not actually unique to I am the man. It had been known or had been recorded before. But by a certain process, according to I am the man's explanation, which was new, by holding a lighted candle in a certain way before the face and gazing out into darkness, in which there is no light of any kind visible, there is a peculiar kind of intensification of sight, by means of which we see in the air before us, in the dark air, as the result of the light and the position it is placed, we suddenly see a pulsating system of what appears to be blood vessels, and what appears to be the full and proper structure of the brain is made visible. Drury tried the experiment and was astonished to see that it appeared to work. The discussion as to what was actually seen on this occasion takes up some point in the text, and I think is rather faithfully and carefully handled with fairness to all theories. But according to I am the man himself, by this process, almost anyone can get a thick peek at his own brain, provided, of course, that he has one. And the assumption is that he has something. So if you are not successful, don't give up. It may not mean that you are mindless, but only that you haven't quite learned the knack of seeing your own brain. Now this would be almost like a trip down the Grand Canyon. Here upon the surface of this mysterious sea, the ship moves by some strange power within itself, an eternal energy power, which reminds us a little bit of Lord Lytton's Vril. The ship is surrounded by an absolute calmness. Nothing seems to move. But at the advice of his eyeless guide, I am the man tossed small pieces of cloth over the side of the boat and into the air. He saw them for a second. They seemed to hover in the air, then suddenly disappeared. Everything he tossed out disappeared. And when he asked to know what happened, his guide reminded him that while the boat seemed to be utterly motionless because it was surrounded by a strange calmness, that it was actually traveling at an almost incredible speed, a speed which was more remarkable because the type of atmosphere and condition there forbade the ordinary phenomena of things appearing to move. And this leads into a very careful study of the nature of motion. a very subtle and interesting point. As soon as these little pieces of material, which I am the man threw over the side of the boat into the air, as soon as they reached the circumference of this zone of sustained or suspended motion which surrounded the boat and by which it was propelled, and passed out beyond this, they immediately disappeared because the boat was actually traveling so rapidly that they were just whisked out of sight instantly, so fast that you couldn't even see what happened to them. On this, therefore, and in this way, it was possible for I Am the Man and his guide to travel a very great distance. And according to various accounts contained in the book, this journey through the underregion actually carried them more than 10,000 miles. But always done by means of these suspensions of time, which is also analyzed, of motion, also considered carefully, and the illusion of distance. These things are all handled in a way that suggests Oriental metaphysics. They are all represented as their peculiar bondage and their peculiar tie to illusion. And I Am the Man is being taken gradually, step by step, away from illusion. And before the book is over, he is told and is asked, and the whole subject is discussed, whether he is ready to recognize that this entire world is a kind of dream, a mystery that exists only because he sustains it, and that while he is held to all these laws and rules and principles that we associate with exact knowledge, he will be a slave held in an underworld like this. It is only when he renounces what he believes or what he knows and becomes interiorly apperceptive to that which really is that he can ever escape from this strange, convoluted universe of mysteries, miseries, and misfortunes. They go along the edge of the great cliff here, and in the course of this discussion, the rising and falling of the surface of this vast body of water, which is so immovable in appearance, and the relation of this overflow to volcanic action is described, and the actual nature and study of volcanoes. Many different ideas from anything commonly held even today relating to these vents and the escape of various pressures from different levels of the Earth's substratum. And always this guide is a perpetual instructor, leading or directing I Am the Man on his difficult journey. Every so often, I Am the Man, incidentally, passes through periods of panic. This is interesting because they are rather inconsistent with the nature of the structure of the pattern. You would not expect him to keep on passing through experiences like this and then suddenly pause and scream that he wanted to go home. You wouldn't expect him to become one moment completely immersed in the mystery of it all and the next moment frightened to death. Yet if we study him psychologically, if we realize what happens when you place a human being under analysis, you find that our hero is acting very much in that way, that he is desperately trying to discover and at the same time frightened to death lest he find out, that his emotions are the strange and mixed emotions of each individual when he comes into a new level of his own subjective. If by this volcanic situation, therefore, he is brought into the presence of the real explanation for the dynamic of his own emotional outbursts, if he is brought into a psychological realization of the origin of schizophrenia or paranoia or dementia or the problems of the manic depressive, if these things are indicated by this journey through the underworld, we can see why he will fight, why he will struggle, why he will hope and fear, why he will scream out to heaven for help one moment and in the next be happy because of the wisdom he is learning. These tantrums and unbalances which mark the story are perfectly consistent with the psychological problem of man attempting to penetrate into his own inner life. Now, having reached down into this strange region still further and further, a strange and rather difficult thing to explain is suddenly, and for no apparent reason, interjected into the story. They come to a place in which there are these strange, fantastic forms representing either fungi or some form of subterranean growth life, something not depending upon the sun, therefore having an entirely different type of energy from what we know. And here, I am the man is asked to eat some of this fruit. As a result of this, he goes into a kind of trance. And the next series of episodes are inserted into the story as a dream within a dream, as something happening in the midst of things happening that are already unbelievable. Now, in this particular happening circumstance, he passes into a very strange sphere, which John Uri Lloyd's book calls the region of the drunkards, of those strangely or mysteriously intoxicated. Now, as we study the story, it becomes obvious that while a great deal is made of acute alcoholism, that is not the subject. It is a convenient way of hiding something. Under the pressure of this, which might almost be considered to be a kind of adventure in mescaline or peyote or something of that nature, I Am the Man has a series of distorted experiences which include all kinds of excessive dream phenomena. But out of this dream phenomena comes a series of very interesting conclusions, which apparently have a bearing upon the major theme, although it's a little difficult to establish. This is what happens in one of the episodes while he is under the influence of this drug. In other words, this does not represent a condition existing in this subterranean region, but a condition existing only in himself. He is told by the eyeless guide that this chamber, which he is now visiting only in a dream, is the abode of other persons who, like himself, have sought truth, but have for one reason or another failed, and that they had reached a place of no return, and that in order to compensate for their essential failure, they had become psychological or mystical drunkards. And these strange things that happened to them were that the various parts of their own bodies, in this case the hand, one hand became infinitely greater than the other parts of the body and absorbed the rest of the body into it. In some areas it was legs and feet that had done this. Others were all heads. And one part of the body had suddenly grown to this immense disproportion. And of all these creatures in the realm of the drunkards, all were deformed in some way. The guide explained to him in the dream, for this was a dream experience, that actually this deformity was real but invisible in all persons who had become contaminated or corrupted by their own inner lives. He pointed out that while these people have bodies, we do not recognize the deformity. But if we could see the soul of an unpleasant person, if we could see the inner form of hatred, or of jealousy, or of destructiveness, or of bitterness, or of worry, or of fear, or persons who had fallen under the intoxication of their own negative psychic factors, that if we could see these persons as they really are, they would be deformed. That the ambitious person would have deformed his inner life until it became all some organ or faculty of his ambition. That his hands or his legs or his head would be all out of proportion with the rest of him. That his total nature, instead of being a beautiful and symmetrical form, would actually be horribly and hideously deformed. because interiorly he is deformed, although it does not show in the body. Thus, if men could see their inner lives, they would all strive for virtue, because otherwise they would find themselves too horrible to bear the semblance of their own natures. But because we cannot see this inner person in the same form or body-like structure that we know, we assume that we're all right on the inside because the outer body retains some semblance of proportion. Actually, the person who is evil inside is crippled, corrupted, deformed, and hideous in appearance. That was the point that was made in the dream. Now, as they proceed on into this mystery, they come finally to the realm of Etidorhpa. And this is the painting that John Uri Lloyd first accepted from Mr. Knapp as the painting of the mysterious Etidorhpa. Knapp felt he'd done a pretty good job in representing the figure or person described as almost like that of Venus and accompanied with a strange lunar crescent. That this was the mysterious goddess of love that appeared with her retinue. And in the whole procedure of this underworld testing, I Am the Man was warned that under no conditions should he touch anything to drink that was offered to him, except this one thing which the guide himself offered him, and which was to prepare him for the world of fantasy. That he must never, therefore, take anything which would cause his faculties to be dimmed. In every instance along the way where he stopped, those who had failed, or those who had themselves been corrupted, urged him to take a drink of something, usually a mysterious green fluid in a small cup. Finally, when in this vision at the end, Etidorhpa appears to him herself, she also offers him the drink. And he is so enraptured and overwhelmed by the splendor of the wonderful company of apparent angels that came with her, that he was on the verge of accepting it, when he suddenly beheld a shadow behind her, a shadow of something that had an evil face or an evil thing, and he threw away the drink, so that even Aphrodite or Etidorhpa tempted him. But when he resisted, she immediately indicated her great pleasure that she had merely been required to try again, to force him to take the waters of Lethe, or forgetfulness, to destroy his own inner life. And here, of course, we can have the psychic factor of emotion, of love versus lust, and of these other things which we find in the ancient rituals, for in Egypt the same thing occurred in the temple rituals. Now, when the book came out, I Am the Man told John Uri Lloyd that this picture was not acceptable. He explained it on the ground that a psychological factor was here. He wouldn't say what it was. Mr. Knapp tried to figure it out. But it appeared that I Am the Man did not want the figure to represent or resemble a Grecian goddess. He did not want it to represent a divine being. What he apparently wanted it to represent was a very simple human person. And that in his symbolism, this was a jarring note. So he commanded and required that the face be redrawn and this picture substituted. It is certainly far less as a work of art than the previous one. But I Am the Man apparently demanded this change. Why was it demanded? Was it because he felt that the other figure was wrong symbolically, that it suggested a dimension or attribute which he did not wish to convey? He did not wish to convey a superhuman being. What he wished to convey was a very human being, one in whom the problem of the adjustments between higher and lower living or thinking or emotion would be played out on the level of human experience. Whatever it may have been, this is the picture that was finally required and approved. The other one appeared only in the first edition and was rejected. Now, gradually, as this play goes on to its final climax, we see I Am the Man crawling up this final pinnacle upon which stands this mysterious eyeless guide. It has been a strange and arduous journey, but the guide seemingly always is able to arrive. But I Am the Man frequently forgets that all he has to do is to think, and he moves. He makes arduous labor. Every time he is discouraged or disillusioned or loses faith in himself, he must crawl. He must struggle desperately to arrive anywhere. The moment he forgets himself, he flies. Here again is a symbolic meaning. The meaning of the tremendous burden that we force upon ourselves by making effort out of action, whereas great action, as Zen points out, is effortless. Now, when he is up here on this pinnacle, I Am the Man has his last moment of revolt, apparently. He decides to destroy this guide who has been with him all the way. He can no longer stand this terrible journey into nothing, this absolute journey into aloneness. And it's at this point that is inserted into the text some very pointed statements from the Masonic ritual. And this eyeless being reminds I Am the Man of the brother who was slain by his brethren. And at that moment, the realization of the fact of the repetition of a crime of violence becomes so great that I Am the Man drops his weapon and falls on his knees, realizing that he has fallen back again into a negative emotional situation. All of this might also mean that the individual, having gone a certain distance, having been led slowly further and further from life as he knows it, suddenly revolts and cries for the world he has left behind, feeling himself utterly alone and forgotten in the edge of space, and seeks once more to return to the old ways, but he cannot. And in his effort to escape, he even wishes to destroy the very light that might help him to escape. Perhaps a reference back again to Captain Morgan. At this point also, they come to the end of the acquaintance with the mysterious eyeless being. In spite of all remarks to the contrary, this being suddenly floats off into space and is gone, and in his place stands this other person, who is again not the Beatrice of Dante's Paradiso, but now again a mysterious symbol taken out of ritual. Here is a new teacher, a higher teacher, a teacher that is to lead him where the eyeless guide cannot go. The eyeless guide cannot go on into the mysterious end of earth, can only go so far and must cease. The rest of the journey must be with this other, very gentle and mysterious person. Where they go, what happens, I Am the Man refuses to say. He says that what happens beyond the edge of that cliff, that is the end of earth, that from there man moves into a state which he can never know till he experiences, and once he has experienced, can never lose the realization of it. That is the end of the incredible and mysterious journey. And Llewyllyn Drury says to I Am the Man, "Tell me what happened afterward." And I Am the Man said, "I cannot and will not. You've gone as far as you can go. I have told you all that I can tell you. Here is the manuscript." And Drury says, "Will I see you again?" The man says, "No. You will never see me again." So he hands the manuscript to Drury, and then standing in front of the fire in Drury's study, slowly fades away in front of him. This is the final episode of the strange and mysterious journey. This is the manuscript that then came into the possession of John Uri Lloyd. This is the manuscript of Etidorhpa, The End of Earth. And the full interpretation of it, the significance of it, is as mysterious as it ever was. But I believe that we will ultimately discover that it is two stories locked within each other. One is an initiation ritual derived from the old ritual mysteries, and the other, the psychological story of man's adventure into his own subconscious. If we assume either of these to be correct, I think we're very close to the story, which is certainly one of the most remarkable of its kind that has ever been done. Lights, please. Now our time is up, so that's all we can do with it this evening. So we'll leave you the gentle task of finding out what it means. And I think the more you think about it, the more interesting it will become. Because we are definitely dealing with one of the most curious productions in literature. A book that is without parallel as a combination of psychological, scientific, philosophical, and mystical experiences. And as such, we hope you have enjoyed this brief interlude into the land of Etidorhpa. Thank you very much.